You are a young mother in 1453 Constantinople. The immense fortifications that have guarded your metropolis for more than 1,000 years are collapsing from the force of Ottoman artillery. Your spouse perished defending the city's defenses 3 days prior. Now, Turkish soldiers are breaching your entrance, and you clasp your infant daughter, realizing that the event set to occur will make his death seem like a relief. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire subjugated territories stretching across 3 continents, from Vienna's borders to the deserts of Yemen. We remember them for architectural wonders such as the Blue Mosque, for ingenious military strategies, and for sultans who significantly altered the course of history. However, there exists another aspect of Ottoman expansion that historians have largely hidden in obscure historical records: a methodical approach to conquest that transformed the most private aspects of human life into weapons. Before proceeding, if you find this type of overlooked history compelling, please consider subscribing. Subscribing and inform me in the comments regarding your viewing location. It genuinely assists us in producing more material like this. Now, let us investigate what truly transpired when Ottoman forces secured a victory. The instant an Ottoman army penetrated enemy fortifications, a meticulously coordinated sequence commenced, which bore no relation to military necessity, but was entirely about systematic exploitation. This was not disarray or the uncontrolled brutality of combat. This constituted official policy, executed with bureaucratic exactitude across hundreds of subjugated cities and towns. When Constantinople finally fell on May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed's troops did not merely plunder and depart. They implemented what Ottoman military manuals referred to as the harvesting protocol. Contemporary Byzantine chroniclers described scenes that sound like something out of horrific dreams, but Ottoman documents treat these identical occurrences as standard administrative procedures. The protocol was ruthlessly efficient. Adult men above the age of 12 were systematically executed, not amidst the fervor of battle, but in structured groups following their surrender. This was not about eliminating military threats. Boys as young as 6 were also slain if they exhibited indications of potential resistance. The Ottomans had learned that allowing male survivors, even children, would create future complications. However, death was reserved for males. Women and young girls confronted a fate considerably worse. Ottoman military legislation, codified in documents still preserved in Turkish archives today, established precise guidelines for what they termed population processing. Women were immediately categorized based on their age, physical condition, and perceived value. This sorting occurred in public plazas, frequently in front of burning churches or ruined civic structures, ensuring maximum psychological impact on both the victims and any remaining inhabitants. Young women aged approximately 14 to 25 comprise the most valuable category. Ottoman records from the Constantinople Conquest list 4,200 women within this specific group, each assigned a numerical identifier and an estimated market worth. These were not abstract figures. They were human beings reduced to inventory items in ledgers that treated them similarly to livestock. The subsequent category encompassed women between the ages of 25 and 40, deemed appropriate for manual labor, but past their prime for other functions. The third classification, women exceeding 40 years of age, faced immediate execution alongside the men, considered too old to warrant the expense of sustenance and transportation. Children presented a distinct opportunity. Boys under 6 years old were taken for the Dev system, the empire's methodical program of cultural and religious conversion. However, girls under 12 entered what Ottoman documents euphemistically called formation programs, designed to prepare them for specific roles within the imperial hierarchy. The psychological warfare integrated into these procedures was planned as meticulously as any military campaign. Families were compelled to witness the sorting process, mothers observing their daughters assigned to various categories, knowing they would never reunite. The Ottomans understood that this emotional trauma would permeate throughout remaining populations, rendering future opposition less probable. Contemporary accounts describe how Ottoman soldiers would intentionally separate mothers from their infant children, not for practical reasons but to intensify emotional distress. Crying babies were often immediately killed, not due to cruelty toward the infants, but to demonstrate absolute authority over their mothers. The message was unequivocal. Resistance signified watching your children perish. The magnitude of what transpired in Constantinople offers a model for comprehending Ottoman conquest patterns across their empire. Within 48 hours of the city's capitulation, approximately 50,000 individuals had undergone processing through these classifications. 12,000 women and girls were loaded onto vessels destined for slave markets in Bursa, Ankara, and other Ottoman cities. An additional 8,000 were distributed among the victorious army as personal possessions. However, the methodical nature of Ottoman practices becomes truly terrifying when we examine their documentation techniques. The empire maintained comprehensive records because these were not spontaneous atrocities of war. They were planned economic endeavors that necessitated meticulous accounting. Ship manifests from that era list human cargo alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. A typical entry might state, 20 bolts Damascus silk, 40 pepper, 15 females aged 16 to 20 years. Excellent condition. The women were not even granted the dignity of names in these documents, only ages, physical descriptions, and estimated values. The economic infrastructure supporting this system extended across the entire Ottoman Empire. Specialized markets in major urban centers featured dedicated sections for human trafficking, with established pricing structures that varied based on supply and demand. A young Greek or Serbian woman might fetch 20 to 30 silver pieces in Istanbul markets, whereas African women commanded different prices depending on their origins and physical attributes. The Ottomans did not originate slavery, but they industrialized it in ways that preceding empires had never accomplished. They developed standardized protocols for capture, transportation, and sale that operated with the efficiency of contemporary corporations. Bills of sale, transport receipts, and market inventories remain in Ottoman archives, chronicling human suffering with the same level of detail applied to any other commercial enterprise. Perhaps most unsettling was how this system generated its own momentum. Success in Ottoman military campaigns was assessed not solely by territory gained, but by the number of people captured. Commanders received additional incentives based on the quantity and quality of prisoners taken. This established motivations for targeting civilian populations rather than exclusively military forces. The psychological effect on surviving populations was precisely what Ottoman strategists intended. Villages and cities that witnessed these processing procedures frequently surrendered without resistance when Ottoman armies appeared on the horizon. The empire's reputation for systematic brutality became a weapon more potent than cannons or cavalry charges. Women who survived the initial categorization faced journeys to various destinations throughout the empire, each presenting its own specific horrors. Those destined for slave markets traveled in specially constructed ships with cargo holds designed for human transport. Maritime archaeological findings disclose ventilation systems, water storage, and waste management designed to sustain human cargo during week-long voyages. These ships were essentially floating prisons, yet they also served as laboratories for systematic dehumanization. Women were deprived of their clothing, names, and any personal belongings that might remind them of their former lives. They were assigned numbers and basic garments that denoted their status as property. This process aimed to break psychological resistance before they reached their final destinations. Ottoman records indicate that mortality rates during transport averaged approximately 15%, considered acceptable losses by administrators who viewed human cargo purely through economic calculations. Women who perished during transit were simply cast overboard, their deaths recorded in ledgers alongside spoiled grain or damaged merchandise. The empire's approach to conquered women reveals a degree of systematic planning that challenges everything we believe we understand about medieval warfare. This was not irrational brutality or cultural misunderstanding. This was deliberate policy implemented over centuries and across continents, designed to transform human beings into commodities while simultaneously terrorizing entire populations into submission. But the true horror was not solely in what occurred during conquest. It was in what followed, when the methodical exploitation of women formed the foundation of Ottoman imperial administration. The empire's legal framework reclassified rape as marriage, murder as justice, and slavery as a divine mandate. Ottoman legal codes, preserved in archives across Turkey, delineate procedures that legalized every conceivable form of sexual violence. These were not anomalies or violations of the law. They constituted the law itself. The concept of war wives became central to Ottoman expansion strategy. When a warrior died in battle against Ottoman forces, his widow automatically became the property of whoever killed him. This was not an informal custom. It was codified legal doctrine with specific protocols for claiming ownership. The claiming procedure required 3 witnesses and had to take place within 72 hours of the husband's demise. After that time frame, other warriors could dispute ownership, leading to conflicts over women akin to disagreements over livestock. Ottoman military courts maintained meticulous records of these ownership battles, treating them as standard property disputes. However, legal ownership was merely the beginning. The transformation of conquered women into war wives necessitated the systematic destruction of their previous identities. Names were changed immediately, often to Turkish versions that bore no resemblance to their birth names. Religious conversion was compulsory, enforced through procedures that combined psychological torment with religious instruction. The conversion process involved public ceremonies where women were compelled to renounce their former faith, often required to spit on religious symbols or burn sacred texts from their previous lives. Those who refused faced progressively severe punishments designed to break resistance without diminishing their market value. The empire maintained conversion centers in major cities, facilities specifically engineered for processing conquered women. Archaeological excavations at sites in Bursa and Edirne, Adrianople, have uncovered building foundations with specialized chambers, drainage systems, and restraint mechanisms that depict industrial-scale psychological warfare. These centers operated for decades, processing thousands of women through standardized programs intended to erase cultural memory and replace it with absolute subservience. These programs typically spanned 6 months, a duration sufficient to ensure pregnancy from systematic rape, thereby creating biological bonds that made escape psychologically unfeasible. Children born from these forced unions faced their own systematic exploitation. Offspring of mixed heritage were often immediately killed if they too closely resembled their mothers, viewed as inconvenient evidence of the rape that brought them into existence. Survivors were raised to serve the empire, never knowing their mothers' true names or original cultures. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual victims to entire populations. The Ottomans deliberately publicized their treatment of conquered women, disseminating detailed accounts throughout territories they planned to invade. The reputation for systematic sexual violence became a weapon of conquest, more potent than any military technology. Villages would surrender without fighting, rather than subject their women to documented Ottoman procedures. The empire's own chroniclers wrote proudly of cities that capitulated instantly upon hearing what had happened to women in previously conquered territories. Fear became their most potent military asset. Yet, surrender offered no protection. The Ottomans had learned that terrorized populations were easier to manage than grateful ones. Even cities that submitted voluntarily often found their women subjected to the same systematic exploitation, justified as essential for imperial security. The tribute system formalized this exploitation on a massive scale. The renowned Devshirme levy that collected boys also encompassed the methodical collection of girls, though this aspect receives considerably less historical attention. Young girls were taken from Christian families under the identical legal framework used for boys, but their ultimate destination and treatment diverged dramatically. While boys might eventually ascend to positions of authority within Ottoman administration, girls vanished into systems crafted for sexual exploitation, and reproductive slavery. Ottoman records indicate that approximately 40% of girls acquired through tribute levies perished within their inaugural year of captivity, victims of systematic abuse that their captors meticulously documented with bureaucratic precision. The survivors faced lives of controlled breeding, managed like agricultural livestock to produce offspring for the empire. These breeding programs operated in facilities across Ottoman territory, with detailed records tracking pregnancy rates, infant mortality, and the productive lifespan of female captives. The empire's approach to female captives reveals mathematical calculations of human suffering that defy comprehension. Ottoman administrators computed the optimal age for capturing girls, the most efficient methods for breaking psychological resistance, and the precise equilibrium between exploitation and survival necessary to sustain productive breeding populations. These calculations appear in administrative documents that treat human suffering as engineering challenges demanding technical resolutions. The stark precision of these records, their matter-of-fact discussion of torture and rape, provides insight into how systematic dehumanization became normalized within imperial culture. The economic incentives driving this system created a reinforcing cycle that intensified over time. Military commanders who seized valuable women received promotions and monetary bonuses. Slave traders who supplied high-quality females gained preferential treatment in imperial contracts. The empire's entire military and administrative structure evolved around the systematic exploitation of subjugated populations. This was not confined to battlefield captures. Ottoman forces conducted regular incursions into neighboring territories, specifically to acquire women and children for imperial utilization. These raids followed seasonal patterns, timed to maximize captures while minimizing military risks. Entire communities endured constant terror of harvest time raids that could shatter families overnight. The raids were meticulously planned with military exactitude, employing intelligence networks that identified the most valuable targets. Ottoman scouts would spend months mapping villages, pinpointing the most attractive women and healthiest children, and planning routes that maximized captures while circumventing military engagement. The psychological impact of living under the perpetual threat of abduction shaped entire cultures. Parents would intentionally disfigure their daughters' faces or fracture their limbs to render them less appealing to Ottoman raiders. The empire had established societies where loving families felt compelled to harm their own offspring to shield them from more terrible destinies. Some communities devised elaborate concealment systems, including underground chambers and forest refuges where women and children could hide during raid seasons. However, the Ottomans adapted their strategies, employing torture to coerce villages into revealing hiding places, transforming survival tactics into fatal traps. The empire's methodical approach to sexual violence engendered cultural transformations that persisted long after Ottoman power waned. Entire regions developed traditions and customs designed around safeguarding women from capture, and social structures that presumed a constant threat of abduction and systematic rape. These cultural adaptations provide evidence of the magnitude and endurance of Ottoman practices. When entire societies reorganized themselves specifically to protect women from systematic sexual violence, that violence became a defining characteristic of their existence. The documentation of these practices exists because the Ottomans perceived nothing shameful in their actions. They recorded their procedures with the same meticulous attention to detail they applied to tax collection or military planning, thereby preserving evidence of systematic brutality that endured for centuries. The empire's record-keeping unveiled something even more disturbing than individual atrocities. They maintained breeding registers, detailed logs tracking the reproductive capacity of enslaved women across their territories. These were not crude tallies, but sophisticated databases that monitored pregnancy cycles, birth outcomes, and the long-term productivity of what they termed their human livestock. Women who survived capture and transportation found themselves assigned identification numbers and housed in facilities specifically designed for maximum reproductive efficiency. Ottoman architects developed standardized architectural plans for these centers, structures that appeared throughout the empire, with identical layouts optimized for controlling and monitoring female captives. These buildings featured small individual cells connected by corridors that permitted guards to observe every movement. Central courtyards provided controlled exercise areas where women could maintain the physical health necessary for childbearing. Specialized medical facilities ensured that pregnancies proceeded successfully, not out of concern for the women, but to safeguard imperial investments. Medical records from these facilities survive in Ottoman archives, documenting procedures that treated women akin to breeding animals. Physicians employed by the empire developed techniques for maximizing pregnancy rates and reducing infant mortality, innovations that served purely economic rather than humanitarian objectives. The empire's method for managing these populations demonstrates industrial-level organization. Women were categorized by age, physical condition, and reproductive history. Those deemed most valuable for breeding received superior food and medical attention. Older women, or those who failed to produce children, faced transfer to manual labor facilities where conditions were intentionally harsh. The psychological manipulation employed in these centers was as systematic as the physical control. Women were informed their families were deceased, shown fabricated evidence of their home village's destruction. The objective was to eradicate any hope of rescue or return, making resistance appear futile. Ottoman administrators discovered that women who believed their former lives had been utterly erased were more compliant and less prone to attempting escape. The empire invested substantial resources in creating and maintaining these psychological fictions, understanding that mental control was more efficacious than physical restraints. The children born in these facilities faced predetermined destinies based on gender and physical characteristics. Boys showing promise were often integrated into Ottoman military or administrative systems after being separated from their mothers at 5 or 6 years of age. Girls were assessed for their potential as future breeding stock or domestic servants. The separation process was designed to be traumatic for mothers, serving both practical and psychological purposes. Women who lost children to imperial systems became more reliant on their captors for emotional support, a calculated strategy that reduced escape attempts and rebellion. These systematic separations created generations of individuals who never knew their true origins or family connections. The Ottoman Empire's methodical exploitation of conquered women was not an anomaly of medieval warfare. It was a deliberate strategy that operated for over 6 centuries, meticulously documented in the empire's own records with bureaucratic exactitude. These practices profoundly shaped the lives of millions, generated cultural trauma that persisted for generations, and serve as a stark reminder of how rapidly civilized societies can normalize the unthinkable when power remains unchecked. The archives containing this information are available, awaiting historians prepared to confront this unsettling truth.